Okay, take 5 now. I have changed devices. Unfortunately, I can't live stream on this one, but I am going to read to you. I will upload this later today. This is our second to last installment, and it ends on a bit of a cliffhanger. So I will try to upload a video on Saturday as well, so that you're not left with the cliffhanger. Here we go. Zero and Stanley are by the boat, the Mary Lou, and they're on their way to head back into camp to try and find the treasure. Zero was the first to spot the Mary Lou, maybe a quarter mile away and just a little off to the right. They headed for it. It wasn't even afternoon yet when they reached the boat. They sat against the shady side and rested. I don't know what happened to my mother, Zero said. She left and never came back. Stanley peeled an onion. She couldn't always take me with her, Zero said. Sometimes she had to do things by herself. Stanley had the feeling that Zero was explaining things to himself. She'd tell me to wait for her in a certain place. When I was real little, I had to wait in small areas, like on a porch step or in a doorway. Now, don't leave here till I get back, she'd say. I never liked it when she left. I had a stuffed animal, a little giraffe, and I'd hug it the whole time she was gone. When I got bigger, I was allowed to stay in bigger areas, like stay on this block or don't leave the park. But even then, I still held Jaffy. Stanley guessed that Jaffy was the name of Zero's giraffe. And then one day, she didn't come back, Zero said. His voice suddenly sounded hollow. I waited for her in Laney Park. Laney Park, said Stanley. I've been there. You know the playscape? Asked Zero. Yeah, I've played on it. I waited there for more than a month, said Zero. You know that tunnel you crawl through between the slide and the swinging bridge? That's where I slept. They ate 4 onions apiece and drank about half of the water. Stanley stood up and looked around. Everything looked about the same in all the directions. When I left camp, I was heading straight towards Big Thumb, he said. I saw the boat off to the right, so that means we need to turn a little to the left. Zero was lost in thought. What? Okay, he said. They headed out. It was Stanley's turn to carry the sack. Some kids had a birthday party, Zero said. I guess about 2 weeks after my mother left. There was a picnic table next to the playscape and balloons tied to it. The kids looked to be about the same age as me. One girl said hi to me and asked if I wanted to play. I wanted to, but I didn't. I knew I didn't belong at that party, even though it wasn't their playscape. There was this one mother who kept staring at me like I was some kind of monster. Then, later, a boy asked me if I wanted a piece of cake, and then the same mother told me, "Get away!" She told all the kids to stay away from me, so I never got that piece of cake. I ran away so fast, I forgot Jaffy. Did you ever find him? It? For a moment, Zero didn't answer. Then he said, he wasn't real. Stanley thought again about his own parents, how awful it would be for them to never know if he was alive or dead. He realized that was how Zero must have felt, not knowing what happened to his own mother. He wondered why Zero never mentioned his father. Hold on, Zero said, stopping abruptly. We're going the wrong way. No, this is right, said Stanley. You were heading towards Big Thumb when you saw the boat off to your right, Zero said. That means we should have gone right when we left the boat. You sure? Zero drew a diagram in the dirt. Stanley still wasn't sure. We need to go this way, said Zero, drawing a line on the map and then heading that way himself. Stanley followed. It didn't seem right to him, but Zero was so sure. Sometime in the middle of the afternoon, a cloud drifted across the sky and blocked out the sun. It was a welcome relief. Once again, Stanley felt destiny was on his side. Zero stopped and held out his arm to stop Stanley too. Listen, Zero whispered. Stanley didn't hear anything. They continued walking very quietly, and Stanley began to make out the faint sounds of Camp Green Lake. They were still too far away to see the camp, but he could hear a blend of indistinct voices. As they got closer, he occasionally could hear Mr. Sir's distinctive bark. They walked slowly and quietly, aware that sound travels in both directions. They approached a cluster of holes. Let's wait here until they go in, said Zero. Stanley nodded. He checked to make sure there was nothing living in it, then climbed down into a hole. Zero climbed into the one next to him. Despite having gone the wrong way for a while, it hadn't taken them nearly as long as Stanley had expected. Now they just had to wait. The sun cut through the cloud, and Stanley felt its rays beating down on him. But soon more clouds filled the sky, shading Stanley and his hole. He waited until he felt certain that the last of the campers had finished for the day. Then he waited a little longer. As quietly as possible, he and Zero climbed out of their holes and crept towards the camp. Stanley held the sack in front of him, cradling in his arms instead of over his shoulders to keep the jars from clanking against each other. A wave of terror rushed over him when he saw the camp compound. The tents, the rec room, the warden's cabin under the 2 oak trees. The fear made him feel dizzy. He took a breath, summoned his courage, and continued. "That's the one," he whispered, pointing out a hole where he had found the gold tube. It was still about 50 yards away, but Stanley was pretty sure it was the right hole. There was no need to risk going any further. They climbed down into adjacent holes and waited for the camp to fall asleep. Chapter 44. Stanley tried to sleep, not knowing when he'd get the chance again. He heard the showers and later the sounds of dinner. He heard the creak of the rec room door. His fingers drummed against the side of his hole. He heard his own heartbeat. He took a drink from the canteen. He had given Zero the water jars. They each had a good supply of onions. He wasn't sure how long he remained in the hole, maybe 5 hours. He was surprised when he heard Zero whispering for him to wake up. He didn't think he'd fallen asleep. If he had, he thought it must have been only for 5 minutes, although when he opened his eyes, he was surprised at how dark it was. There was only one light on at the camp, in the office. The sky was cloudy, so there was very little starlight. Stanley could see a sliver of the moon, which appeared and disappeared among the clouds. He carefully led Zero to the hole, which was hard to find in the darkness. He stumbled over a small pile of dirt. "I think this is it," he whispered. "You think?" Zero asked. "It is," Stanley said, sounding more certain than he really was. He climbed down. Zero handed him the shovel. Stanley stuck the shovel into the dirt at the bottom of the hole and stepped on the back of the blade. He felt it sink beneath his weight. He scooped up some dirt and tossed it off to the side. Then he brought the shovel back down. Zero watched for a while. "I'm going to try and refill the water jars," he said. Stanley took a deep breath and exhaled. "Be careful," he said. Then he continued digging. It was so dark he couldn't even see the end of his shovel. For all he knew, he could be digging up gold and diamonds instead of dirt. He brought each shovelful close to his face, trying to see if anything was there before dumping it out of the hole. As he made the hole deeper, it became harder to lift the dirt up and out. It was 5 feet deep before he'd started. He decided to use his efforts to make it wider instead. This made more sense, he told himself. If Kate Barlow had buried a treasure chest, she probably wouldn't have been able to dig much deeper, so why should he? Of course, Kate Barlow had probably had a whole gang of thieves helping her. "You want some breakfast?" Stanley jumped at the sound of Zero's voice. He hadn't heard him approach. Zero handed him down a box of cereal. Stanley carefully poured some cereal into his mouth. He didn't want to put his dirty hands inside the box. He nearly gagged on the ultra-sweet taste. They were sugar-frosted flakes, and after eating nothing but onions for more than a week, he had trouble adjusting to the flavour. He washed them down with a swig of water. Zero took over the digging. Stanley sifted his fingers through the fresh piles of dirt, in case he'd missed anything. He wished he had a flashlight. A diamond, no bigger than a pebble, would be worth thousands of dollars, yet there was no way he'd see it. They finished the water that Zero had gotten from the spigot by the showers. Stanley said he'd go fill the jars again, but Zero insisted that he do it instead. "No offence, but you make too much noise when you walk. You're too big." Stanley returned to the hole. As the hole grew wider, parts of the surface kept caving in. They were running out of room. To make it much wider, they would first have to move some of the surrounding dirt piles out of the way. He wondered how much time they'd had before the camp awoke. "How's it going?" Zero asked when he returned with the water. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. He brought the shovel down to the side of the hole, shaving off a slice of the dirt wall. As he did so, he felt the shovel bounce off something hard. "What was that?" asked Zero. Stanley didn't know. He moved his shovel up and down the side of the hole. As the dirt chipped and flaked away, the hard object became more pronounced. It was sticking out of the side of the hole, about 1.5 feet from the bottom. He felt it with his hands. "What is it?" Zero asked. He could just feel a corner of it. Most of it was still buried. It had a smooth, cool texture, like metal. "I think I might have just found the treasure chest," he said, His voice was filled with more astonishment than excitement. "Really?" asked Zero. "I think so," said Stanley. The hole was wide enough for him to hold the shovel lengthways and dig sideways into the wall. He knew he had to dig very carefully. He didn't want the side of the hole to collapse, along with the huge pile of dirt directly above it. He scraped at the dirt wall until he exposed the entire side of the box-like object. He ran his fingers over it. It felt to be about 8 inches tall and almost 2 feet wide. He had no way of knowing how far into the earth it extended. He tried pulling it out, but it wouldn't budge. He was afraid that the only way to get to it was to start back up at the surface and dig down. And they didn't have time for that. "I'm going to try to dig a hole underneath it," he said. "Then maybe I can pull it down and slip it out." "Go for it," said Zero. Stanley jammed the shovel into the bottom edge of his hole and carefully began to dig a tunnel underneath the metal object. He hoped it didn't cave in. Occasionally he'd stop, stoop down and try to feel the far end of the box, but even when the tunnel was as long as his arm, he still couldn't feel the other side. Once again he tried pulling it out, but it was firmly in the ground. If he pulled too hard, he feared he'd cause a cave-in. He knew that when he was ready to pull it out, he would have to do so quickly before the ground above it collapsed. As his tunnel grew deeper and wider and more precarious, Stanley was able to feel the latches on the end of the box. And then a leather handle. It wasn't really a box. "I think it might be some kind of metal suitcase," he told Zero. "Can you pry it loose with the shovel?" Zero suggested. "I'm afraid that the side of the hole will collapse." "You might as well give it a try," said Zero. Stanley took a sip of water. "Might as well," he said. He forced the tip of his shovel between the dirt and the top of the metal case and tried to wedge it free. He wished he could see what he was doing. He worked the end of the shovel back and forth, up and down, until he felt the suitcase fall free. Then he felt the dirt piling down on top of it. But it wasn't a huge cave-in. As he knelt in the hole, he could tell that only a small portion of the earth had collapsed. He dug his hands until he found the leather handle, and then he pulled the suitcase up and out of the dirt. "I've got it!" he exclaimed. It was heavy. He handed it up to Zero. "You did it!" Zero said, taking it from him. "We did it!" said Stanley. He gathered his remaining strength and tried to pull himself up out of the hole. Suddenly, a bright light was shining in his face. "Thank you," said the warden. "You boys have been a big help." Chapter 45. I'm going to go for another couple of pages. The beam of the flashlight was directed away from Stanley's eyes and onto Zero, who was sitting on his knees. The suitcase was on his lap. Mr. Pedanski was holding the flashlight. Mr. Sir stood next to him with his gun drawn and pointed in the same direction. Mr. Sir was barefoot and bare-chested, wearing only his pyjama bottoms. The warden moved towards Stanley. She was also in her bedclothes, wearing an extra long t-shirt. Unlike Mr. Sir, however, she had on her boots. Mr. Pedanski was the only one fully dressed. Perhaps he'd been on guard duty. Off in the distance, Stanley could see 2 more flashlights bobbing in the darkness. He felt hopeless in the hole. "You boys arrived just in the nick," the warden started to say. She stopped talking, and she stopped walking. Then she slowly backed away. A lizard had crawled on top of the suitcase. Its big red eyes glowed in the beam of the flashlight. Its mouth was open, and Stanley could see its white tongue moving in and out between its black teeth. Zero sat as still as a statue. A second lizard crawled up the side of the suitcase and stopped less than an inch from Zero's little finger. Stanley was afraid to look and afraid not to. He wondered if he should try to scramble out of the hole before the lizards turned on him, but he didn't want to cause any commotion. The second lizard crawled across Zero's fingers and halfway up his arm. It occurred to Stanley that the lizards were probably on the suitcase when he'd handed it to Zero. "There's another one!" gasped Mr. Pedanski. He shined the flashlight on the box of frosted flakes, which lay open beside Stanley's hole. A lizard was crawling out of it. The light from the flashlight also illuminated Stanley's hole. He glanced downwards and had to force himself to suppress a scream. He was standing in a lizard nest. He felt the screams explode inside him. He could see 6 lizards. There were 3 on the ground, 2 on his left leg, and 1 on his right sneaker. He tried to remain very still. Something was crawling up the back of his neck. The other 3 counsellors approached the area. Stanley heard one of them say, "What's going?" and then whisper, "Oh my God." "What are we going to do?" asked Mr. Pedanski. "We wait," said the warden. "It won't be very long." "At least we'll have a body to give that woman," said Mr. Pedanski. "She's going to ask a lot of questions," said Mr. Sir, and this time she'll have the AG with her." "Let her ask her questions," the warden said. "Just as long as we have the suitcase, I don't care what happens. Do you know how long?" Her voice trailed off and then started up again. "When I was little, I'd watch my parents dig holes every weekend and holiday. When I got bigger, I had to dig too, even on Christmas." Stanley felt tiny claws dig into the side of his face as the lizard pulled itself off his neck and up past his chin. "It won't be long now," said the warden. Stanley could hear his heartbeat. Each beat told him he was still alive, at least for 1 more second. Chapter 46. 500 seconds later, his heart was still beating. Mr. Pedanski screamed! The lizard, which had been in the cereal box, was springing towards him. Mr. Sir shot it in mid-air. Stanley felt the blast shatter the air around him. The lizards scurried frantically across his very still body. He did not flinch. A lizard ran across his closed mouth. He glanced at Zero. Zero's eyes met his. Somehow they were both still alive, at least for 1 more second, 1 more heartbeat. Mr. Sir lit a cigarette. "I thought you quit," said one of the other counsellors. "Yeah, well, sometimes sunflower seeds, they just won't cut it." He took a long drag of the cigarette. "I'm going to have nightmares for the rest of my life." "Maybe we should just shoot them?" suggested Mr. Pedanski. "Who?" asked a counsellor. "The lizards or the kids?" Mr. Pedanski laughed grimly. "The kids are going to die anyway." He laughed again. "At least we got plenty of graves to choose from." "We've got time," said the warden. "I've waited this long. I can wait another few." Her voice trailed off. Stanley felt a lizard crawl in and out of his pocket. "We're going to keep the story simple," said the warden. "That woman's going to ask a lot of questions. The AG will most likely initiate an investigation. So this is what happened. Stanley tried to run away in the night, fell in a hole, and the lizards got him. That's it. We're not even going to give them Zero's body. As far as anybody knows, Zero doesn't exist. Like my mom said, we got plenty of graves to choose here." "Why would he run away if he knew he was getting released today?" Mr. Pedanski asked. "Who knows? He's crazy. That's why we couldn't release him yesterday. He was delirious and we had to keep watch over him so he wouldn't hurt himself or anybody else." "She's not going to like that," said Mr. Pedanski. "She's not going to like anything we tell her," said the warden. She stared at Zero and at the suitcase. "Why aren't you dead yet?" she asked. Stanley only half listened to the talk of the counsellors. He didn't even know who that woman was or what AG meant. He didn't even realise they were initials. They sounded like one word, AG. His mind was focused on the tiny claws that moved up and down his skin and through his hair. He tried to think about other things. He didn't want to die with the image of the warden, Mr. Sir, and the lizards etched into his brain. Instead, he tried to see his mother's face. His brain took him back to a time when he was very little, all bundled up in a snowsuit. He and his mother had been walking, hand in hand, mitten in mitten, when they both slipped on some ice and fell and rolled down a snow-covered hillside. They ended up at the bottom of the hill. He remembered he'd almost cried, but instead he laughed, and his mother laughed too. He could feel the same light-hearted feeling he'd felt then, dizzy from rolling down the hill. He felt the sharp coldness of the snow against his ears. He could see flecks of snow on his mother's bright and cheery face. This was where he wanted to be when he died. "Hey, caveman, guess what?" said Mr. Sir. "You're innocent, after all. I thought you'd like to know. Your lawyer came to get you yesterday. Too bad you weren't here." The words meant nothing to Stanley, who was still in the snow. He and his mother climbed up back up the hill and rolled down again, this time on purpose. Later they had hot chocolate with lots of melted marshmallows. "It's getting close to 4:30, said Mr. Pedanski. "They'll be waking up." The warden told the councillors to return to the tents. She told them to give the campers breakfast and to make sure they didn't talk to anyone. As long as they did that, as they were told, they wouldn't have to dig any more holes. If they talked, they would be severely punished. "How should we say they will be punished?" one of the councillors asked. "Let them use their imagination," said the warden. Stanley watched the councillors return to the tents, leaving only the warden and Mr. Sir behind. He knew the warden didn't care whether the campers dug any more holes or not. She'd found what she was looking for. He glanced at Zero. A lizard was perched on his shoulder. Oh, fudge. A lizard was perched on his shoulder. Zero remained perfectly still, except for his right hand, which slowly formed into a fist. Then he raised his thumb, giving Stanley a thumbs-up sign. Stanley thought back to what Mr. Sir had said to him earlier, and the bits of conversation he'd overheard. He tried to make sense out of it. Mr. Sir had said something about a lawyer, but Stanley knew his parents couldn't afford a lawyer. His legs were sore from remaining rigid for so long. Standing still was more strenuous than walking. He slowly allowed himself to lean against the side of the hole. The lizards didn't seem to mind. Chapter 47. Last chapter before we stop. The sun was up and Stanley's heart was still beating. There were 8 lizards in the hole with him. Each one had exactly 11 yellow spots. The warden had dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep and lines across her forehead and face which seemed exaggerated in the stark morning light. Her skin looked blotchy. "Satan," said Zero. Stanley looked at him, unsure if Zero had even spoken or if he'd just imagined it. "Why don't you go and see if you can take the suitcase from Zero?" the warden suggested. "Yeah, right," said Mr. Sir. "The lizards obviously aren't hungry," said the warden. "Then you go get the suitcase," said Mr. Sir. They waited. "Satanly, Satanly," said Zero. Sometime later, Stanley saw a tarantula crawl across the dirt, not too far from his hole. He'd never seen a tarantula before, but there was no doubt what it was. He was momentarily fascinated by it, as its big, hairy body moved slowly and steadily along. "Look, a tarantula," said Mr. Sir, also fascinated. "I've never seen one before," said the warden, "except in—" Stanley felt a sharp sting on the side of his neck. But the lizard hadn't bitten him. However, it was merely pushing off. It leapt straight off Stanley's neck and pounced on the tarantula. The last Stanley saw of it was one hairy leg sticking out of the lizard's mouth. "Not hungry, huh?" said Mr. Sir. Stanley tried to return to the snow, but it was harder to get there when the sun was up. As the sun rose, the lizards moved lower in the hole, keeping mainly in the shade. They were no longer on his head and shoulders, but had moved down to his stomach, legs, and feet. He couldn't see any lizards on Zero, but he believed there were 2 between Zero's knees, shading from the sun by the suitcase. "How are you doing?" Stanley asked quietly. He didn't whisper, but his voice was dry and raspy. "My legs are numb," said Zero. "I'm going to try to climb out of the hole," said Stanley. As he tried to push himself up, using just his arms, he felt a claw dig into his ankle. He gently eased himself back down. "Is your last name your first name spelled backwards?" Zero asked. Stanley stared at him in amazement. Had he been working on that all night? He heard the sound of approaching cars. Mr. Sir and the warden heard them as well. That's where we're stopping for today. I will pick up. I promise I will read the last few chapters and put them up online tomorrow. I'm going to do it as a video that I upload rather than trying with live stream again, because I'm feeling that that's not as reliable as we'd hoped. So I hope you enjoyed this installment. If you would like to try the Kahoot, I have sent the link, but I will also tell it to you now. Ooh, if I can find it. The link for today's Kahoot is 0882145. That's 0882145. Good luck, guys, and we're only one more 20-minute reading session away from finishing holes. Very exciting. Have a fantastic weekend, and I will talk to you all again very soon. Bye!